Welcome to another episode of the Talent Transformation Podcast. Today we have Salma Rashad, the Executive Vice President of Talent Acquisition at Siemens. Salma, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are
Wonderful.
you?
Good. I'm doing good. So Salma, you are relatively new at Siemens by the Siemens standards, I would say, right? About a year and a half there. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. I joined in 2023, and Siemens is a long-standing company, so I'm definitely relatively new compared to a lot of my colleagues.
Yeah, I'm sure. But before we go into talking a little bit about Siemens, give me a little bit of your background. How did you end up in talent acquisition?
Well, I started my career in HR as a business partner, as a generalist, and I always found myself getting involved in recruitment tasks, activities, projects. There was something for me, I think, about that proximity of working with the business and also working with external candidates to find roles. So somehow, slowly, I progressed from being a generalist into a specialist. And I have to say, I never looked back. Talent acquisition is one of these functions that is always changing. It's a very dynamic function, so I never felt bored in talent acquisition.
Would you say that talent acquisition is the tough spot to be in HR?
In my opinion, yes.
Yeah.
It's a big challenge, but very rewarding, I find. I always like to think that it's the closest to a sales organization, if
Yeah.
we think about it from a business standpoint, because you're out there finding candidates, closing deals, negotiating. So it requires a very different skill set, which frankly suits me very well.
Right. And you're coming into a engineering company and technology company. You were in pharmaceuticals before, is that right?
Yes, correct. I had the pleasure to work across a number of different industries, and that was actually not something that I was keen at the beginning, because there was always a sort of an understanding that you should become an expert in a specific industry. But I challenged myself around that, and I have to say, I definitely would not have done it differently because having seen talent acquisition executed in a number of different industries really allows me to bring in a different perspective to this role.
Let's talk about Siemens then. So you come into a tech company. Siemens has changed a lot in the last 5 or 6 years,
Mhm.
right? They've spun out the energy business. They've spun out the healthcare business. They're focusing on the industrial technology area. Um, I think you still make trains, though. Are you making
We,
trains,
we,
right?
we do, we do.
Yes.
Siemens has such a long history and heritage. And I think that's what makes it unique. It's not really comparable with other technology companies per se, because its history inception is obviously different. So that's where I think the ambition today is very clear. I think we have all an understanding that we want to become a one technology company. We want to be able to leverage the scale that Siemens has, the products, the innovation to deliver faster growth, better innovation cycles, and closer proximity as well to the customers. So I think that's a very exciting proposition, and to see that and be part of that transformation is very unique.
And when you go to market, um, and your technology is a lot of industrial uh, uh, automation type technology, the average consumer doesn't experience that technology directly, right? So if you go to market as Google, you say, I'm a tech company, and everybody says, absolutely. But you go to market as Siemens Recruiting, and some people might say, no, you're an engineering company, you're not a tech company. So how are you thinking about the brand? And you have to reposition this brand very specifically now recruiting? And how far along that journey are you?
I think when we think about Siemens, I agree with you. There are certain connotations from a consumer product standpoint. But what we have observed through research, through focus group, through a lot of channels in terms of analysis, we've seen a shift in terms of perception. We see that very clearly in the number of roles we have in technology. We see that in certain markets where we are not well positioned or maybe well known,
Yeah.
frankly speaking, versus other competitors. So rather than taking just one broad approach, thinking that this is going to work everywhere, we're looking at markets where we need to do an additional efforts, because we know that there are certain markets where we are very well positioned in that front, according to the rankings and research. But our focus really needs to be in the markets where we have to close that gap now.
So when you came into Siemens, what was your first instinct? What did you do first? Did you go around and meet with hiring managers in these different business units and try and figure out what their challenges were? Tell me about that, how you came into the company.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I did was to do a listening tour. So that drove my assistant a little bit crazy, because I had so many hiring managers and business leaders to talk to. And my idea was just to listen. Obviously, I was brought in for a reason.
Sure.
I have talent acquisition, expertise, experience. But it's really important to understand the context, the culture, the psyche, before going out and starting to do things and bring new ideas. And that listening tour actually has been fantastic, because it has helped me uncover a lot of the areas that we are focusing our strategy on now.
Mhm.
I think it's always easy for a new leader to come in and kind of say, well, nothing really has worked in the past. And
Here's my new
here is
idea.
my new idea.
Yeah,
But
right.
actually, it's much harder to recognize what this organization stands for and the certain good things that are happening.
Yeah.
So whether we want to scale these solutions, which we have excellent pockets of best practices, or whether we want to evolve them and bring in new ideas, that's where the magic happens. So for me, that listening tour helped me to anchor myself into the Siemens culture. So to be in a position of strength to present our strategy and ideas for TA.
Okay. And you're talking globally. So how many countries are we talking about here? Every country, almost every country in the world.
Yeah, the scope is quite big. But on the other hand, the way that I see it is there needs to be collaboration between what the Global Center of Excellence does and what the local country TA operations and business operations do. And that's where I have worked in models where it was a top-down approach, the center is driving everything. I've worked in other models that were very much decentralized models. But Siemens is somewhere in between.
Okay.
And that's where the co-creation journey that we've been and we're going through at the moment is allowing us to create local solutions.
Right. Right. And so now you're building your team globally. What's that experience like? Are is it going to take you, how long is it going to take you to be where you want to be? Do you know yet?
So the good thing is, when I think about talent acquisition is part of talent management and our people and organization strategy globally. So I don't see that as a silo in itself. The way that we've set up our P&O strategy is taking us to 2030. So we have set certain ambitions around that, and that gives us the opportunity to deliver on these ambitions. So there are certain steps that we are taking now, from setting the foundations to make sure we have a strong core of operations. And there are certain things that are going to take us longer. There are certain things around operating model transformation, shared services capabilities, around talent segmentation. And everybody is talking today about skills, how
Right.
to acquire these hard to fill roles, and how to acquire these business critical skills. And that just doesn't happen in a silo in TA. So we need to work together with our talent management colleagues, with our P&O business partner organization, to make sure we understand what are we looking for in the market. And based on that, obviously create the right level of strategies for the organization.
Right. Right. So I noticed that Siemens was ranked by Forbes for in 2024, this year, for women
Yeah,
in
employers.
as an employer.
Mm.
Yes. Tell me about that a bit, because that's pretty tough in tech and even tougher in what I would call traditional engineering. Uh,
Yeah, that's true, and I think I see it in a number of different ways. On a professional level, coming into Siemens, looking at all the different diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that we have, the mentorship programs that we have, gives us a very strong indicator that the business takes this as an important imperative. This is not a nice to have thing to do. But also I take it more on a personal level, because I experience that every day. I have a daughter and I have a son, and I actually last week brought them to the office in Zurich, in Switzerland, and they had a chance to spend the day. And I was really excited to see how my daughter could, at 11 years old, be interested in AI and being exposed to the different technologies. So there's something about creating that excitement
yeah.
early on in the journey, and that is part of the culture. Company like Siemens, that has been around for such a long time, more than 177 years, the basis needs to be innovation and agility. And without diversity, that is not able, we are not able to bring that to life. We do have a lot of opportunities and initiatives where we are bringing coding camps to children, sponsored by Siemens. And that allows them early on to test these hypotheses. Do they like it? Do they enjoy it? What does it actually mean for them? And that's where I see an important role that we play with society. So that's not only about just attracting talent for our company, but this is also bringing the skills that we need for the future workforce.
Right. Well, so you have some resources coming into Siemens that some people that run talent acquisition don't have, because you are coming into a very big and maybe top, in terms of tech, maybe top 10, believe it or not. Some people might not think so, but it is up there. And so you have the ability to address, people in high school and build programs and connect with society that maybe smaller tech companies might not have the capability to do. So how are you thinking about that? How are you thinking about your generational strategy?
I think we start to think about that from a talent attraction standpoint, and we had certain discussions around Gen Alpha already, their preferences,
Gen Alpha, there you
and
New one.
and how they consume information. So all of that is important for us to start anticipating some of these generations coming into the workplace. But we also see it with our role in society. And sometimes that role might not be very visible in certain places. I remember discussing with one of my external peers in the US. Her son is studying in one of the top universities, engineering. And she was telling me that, yes, they are using this software in the university and so on. And I was like, are you sure? Is that a Siemens software? And she wasn't very sure, actually. Then she ended up coming back to me and said, you know what? Actually, it is a Siemens software. So maybe sometimes it's not a very well-known fact
Yeah,
about
right.
where we play and our impact, but we are certainly very conscious
Right.
about that possibility of creating that impact early on.
So you've talked a lot about the next gen manager, the type of person that you want to be leading in leadership roles, inside the organization. Are you creating an archetype? Are you experimenting with what kind of person is going to be the next leader inside of Siemens?
I think we've moved away from that narrative of what the perfect leader looks like
Okay.
and adapted more of a growth mindset and more of a culture of empowerment. So we see, considering the transformation that Siemens is going through, there are two types of leaders, more or less. One that are certainly involved in the bigger work streams of that technology, being one technology company ambition. So certainly we see organizational development and change management capabilities being an important component of that. On the other hand, we have many line leaders, thousands of line leaders who need to run the day-to-day operations. And that's where team effectiveness is important. People experience is important. So that's our philosophy when it comes to leadership and leaders who transform, as we like to articulate that around our P&O ambition.
Right. So you're sort of looking at your candidates too, and you're trying to figure out what it is that they do best, right? And sort of work them into the organization based on what their talents are.
Yes, indeed. And considering again the volumes that we deal with, our teams are always looking at ways to bring in assessment strategies that help us and allow us to select these leaders. So we have been experimenting with a number of different ideas, tools around that. But we also want to bring more thinking around what is the team composition looking like. So the leader as an individual, but the leader also within a context of a team. How
Yeah.
does that look like?
Yeah.
So-
Well, I think generationally, what we've discovered is that the idea of what a leader does in the younger generations is very different than what the idea was for maybe my generation. My generation was very top down. I think we inherited top down from the people above us when we came into the organization. And the younger generation is not as interested in top down leadership. So how are you thinking about how that new behavior comes into an organization that, has, again, I'll go back to like a Google. It's a 30-year-old company.
Mhm.
Okay. I mean, there was nobody there in 1996 at all. There was no room, right? To a big engineering company. It's been around for 100 and some odd, 170 years, maybe. I'm not sure exactly how many, but something like that. And probably historically a very top-down management structure, that now is giving way to a new way of doing things.
Yeah, one particular way of doing new things is actually we've moved away from performance management. So that is not a once in a year activity anymore,
Yeah.
but we've replaced that with growth talks. That's what we call it here at Siemens. So this allows us to have a different type of conversation between manager and their people. It can also be initiated actually by the person. So it's not only top down. The employee can raise their hand and just say, I want to have a growth talk with my manager.
Okay.
And that is just an example of how we evolve to adapt to these preferences. So for sure, there are a lot of, I would say, examples that we can bring at Siemens. But one of them that really stood out for me was the growth talks, because that's not
Yeah.
something I've actually experienced in other companies.
So you have a recruiting team that has to tell these stories to candidates. How do you get all of your recruiters to understand these stories and be able to paint this picture to candidates? Do you sit around with them and talk about storylines, talk about the way you position this with prospects?
So we certainly have a big challenge because our teams are decentralized. So it means that we need to get the message out to a number of different groups. So that is a challenge in itself. However, the way we've approached it is, first of all, we have to create a clear narrative. We have to all describe what does good look like for us. Articulate that, share that, deploy that, keep repeating that, because we know that's very important, especially in the recruitment function. Sometimes you have attrition, people come and go.
Sure.
So that needs to be present. The second thing I would say is a very clear approach of upskilling. So this is not only about just cascading the messages and saying you need to be saying these things, but actually creating learning opportunities and learning paths that bring that to life. We are also in the position now to launch something more specific for TA leaders. So we're doing a TA leaders lab, which will allow us to double down on some of these skills with these leaders, because we know that they are the enablers at the end of the day with their teams on a day-to-day basis. So that strategy will allow us to tackle these messaging and deploy them into the organization, and I would say in a sustainable manner, because I have observed in certain companies it's a big, huge effort, and we do that at the launch of a transformation, for example, and then it just fizzles out. So how do you also keep that in a sustainable way? How do you sustain these efforts? How do you become consistent? That's where that consistency pays off, because it becomes part of the behavior, and that's where we want to get at.
So besides training recruiters, are you evaluating recruiters on their ability to deliver this message, and then sort of saying, okay, you're not quite there yet, that your story's not a good enough story, so you have to go back and work on that, and maybe somebody else, the story is, well, fantastic, out of the box. Sometimes that happens. How much do you look at across the team and try and figure out who's there and who's not there?
Well, we want to think more about the results of that, and how does it actually translate into hiring, better NPS scores, both from hiring managers as well as from candidates. And a big part of the focus of our TA strategy is actually creating exceptional experiences. This is something that we have and we are embedding in our approach from a global standpoint, and that will help us shift our mindset around, my goal is to create exceptional experience. My goal is to make sure that the candidate, no matter what the outcome is for the candidate, would turn around and say, you know what, I didn't get that job at Siemens, but that was an amazing experience. That
I go back and interview again. I try again.
Exactly. And that I think is not only just upskilling, but that also means that we need to create systems and ecosystems and processes that enable the recruiters to actually be able to deliver on that promise. And that's a long game that we are playing.
Yeah. How many hiring managers are we talking about here? First of all, just about like.
Oh, wow. That's a good question. I mean, considering we fill more than 30,000 hires a year.
Okay.
So would say, it's
maybe 5,000 to 10,000 hiring managers.
Possibly. Yes. Yeah. So there are different ways that we can talk about it, because we have mature teams, I would say, at Siemens, seasoned teams as well. We've gone through a number of different transformation. And certainly we've been able to deliver as a recruitment function. So there are a lot of good things happening. And it's always about, for us, how do we take things from good to great?
Yeah. That takes a little time.
It takes time, but you have to have that as a North Star.
Yeah.
And you have to think about it as something that not only an aspiration and nice to have, but how do you actually bring this to life for recruiters? Because I see a lot of nice slogans and nice aspirations, but if this doesn't translate into tangible ways of doing things and doing things differently, using technology, enablement of recruiters, then it just becomes a lot of hot air here.
Right. Figuring out how to be very strategic for the business is not trivial, right? The business would like to think that the market has everything they need, okay? And the recruiter often gets stuck trying to explain that the market doesn't have what we need. How do you deal with that? How do you coach your TA team to deal with that type of situation?
I think that's the eternal question that we have in talent acquisition, and that's what makes it exciting. So I see it in two folds. There is a recruiter role, but there's also hiring manager role in the process. So we do invest as well in hiring manager trainings that allows us to explain market dynamics, for example, that allows us to explain what does a good process looks like. Because sometimes, even if we find the purple squirrel,
Yeah.
if we sit on that purple squirrel
For
for
3 weeks.
maybe even 1 week,
Yeah.
it's too late.
Yeah.
So that's where that work with hiring manager needs to be very tight, very close. And we talk about TA as a team sport, that this is not only on recruiters to deliver, but it's also on the hiring manager to work with the recruitment team to be able to get the best candidate. So I see it as a really two folds here: the recruiter's role plus the hiring manager's role here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the recruiter can only go so far without the hiring manager. And how do you work? The recruiter tells a certain story. The candidate goes in, they meet hiring managers. Very important that the story is consistent, right? So how do you look at that afterwards? Do you look at the candidate experience and do a deep dive on people that have come through the organization? How was your experience? When did it change? Not just surveys, but do you actually sit down and talk to candidates that succeeded in getting through the process?
So I think the best stories are the data-driven stories. So certainly we in TA are very fortunate because we sit on a lot of data, but sometimes we're not very good at using that as part of the storytelling. And that's where I see my aspiration here for us as a function at Siemens to leverage more the data and work with partners that allow us to leverage the data. So certainly there are a number of different KPIs that we can bring to the table. I can also think about how we are leveraging talent market intelligence as part of that story, because we do receive a huge number of applications, but that doesn't necessarily translate to means we have hundreds of viable candidates. Actually, we don't.
Right.
And that requires us to be able to have a clear business acumen to understand how to go through these CVs. What does good look like for this role? How do we bring the data to the table when we're talking to hiring managers? How do we do in certain teams retrospectives about how the recruitment happens? And talking to one of our TA country leaders, they mentioned to me that they actually bring in a hiring manager to do that retrospective with their own team.
Okay.
And that, I think, brings a different level of credibility, because it's just not only about us looking at the data and seeing what the data is telling us, but that human voice and that voice over brings a different perspective to that retrospective. And the goal is to make sure that we are incorporating the feedback for the next round, for the next cycles. That's how, again, working in an agile, inspired way, as I like to say it, will allow us to improve the function.
Yeah. And are you also thinking about working with talent management to figure out how well your hires have done inside the organization? And are you using that data then to adjust who you're recruiting or how you're recruiting, or is it too early for you to be sort of at that stage yet?
Well, we monitor a number of different, I would say, indicators. Of course, attrition rates of new hires. And as we at Siemens don't have performance management, so we don't have performance management ratings, for example, that is typically used, I would say, to evaluate quality of hires. But we do have strong collaboration, I have to say, between our analytics team, our talent management team. A small example of what I mentioned, we're looking at the skills approach, the skills taxonomy. So there's definitely a lot of collaboration that's happening across between the functions at the moment.
Are you fully satisfied with where you are on skills yet, or are you transitioning? A lot of companies are transitioning to a skills-based taxonomy and a skills as a currency within the organization. How far along that journey are you right now?
We are in the same boat, I would say. So we are in that transition state at the moment. And I do exchange with a lot of external colleagues. And I think we're all in different stages of that journey. I'm not sure whether there's somewhere that have completely nailed that piece.
No.
But we do have certain examples where we have deployed solutions for skills-based hiring.
Yeah.
And are these solutions scalable? Not yet. That's what
Right.
we are testing. And that's where I believe it's important to start small. Don't create a big bang straight away, but find the right use case and find the right opportunities to test these hypotheses before you go out and make a bigger investment, which is actually what we have been doing in talent acquisition.
Okay. And let's just throw in AI here, because no conversation would be complete without
Absolutely.
artificial intelligence. And we could approach it from, I guess, many different angles. But obviously, Siemens as a tech company has to go deep into artificial intelligence, and there's probably a lot of demand for AI expertise. There's obviously more demand in the market than there is supply. That's probably going to stay that way for the next 5 years, if not longer. How are you dealing with that anxiety within the management team?
I guess the good news is that it's not all on TA's shoulder. So we do not see that the only way of doing that is just acquiring these skills.
Sure.
But we're actually investing heavily in upskilling and reskilling. And that, I think, distributes nicely that pressure across. So the learning organization, the talent management organization, and even the businesses themselves are heavily invested in that. The other component, I would say, is I'm seeing a lot of experimentation happen internally, because for sure one thing is knowing that we need that, but what do we need it for, and where do we need that, and what type of skills, what does that actually look like in our Siemens environment?
Yeah.
So I think that internal experimentation is allowing us to better refine our thinking around what these skills actually look like, where do we need them, and from there, whether that is an acquisition strategy or this is a build or a buy, there are different ways to go about it. And we see Siemens very actively engaged externally in acquisitions of other companies, and these are also ways for us to strengthen our portfolio.
Yeah. So a year and a half in, you seem pretty excited, pretty charged up.
Yes, believe it or not, our Siemens Business Conference title was Supercharge. So
Okay.
I'm really carrying that message with me. And it's hard not to, because you look around and you see this company with this amazing heritage, amazing portfolio, amazing potential and ambition. And me being here and playing part of that in that journey,
Yeah.
it's just very exciting.
Well, isn't that so key within the talent acquisition team too? Because it's not just a story, right? The candidates immediately start evaluating the company based on how excited the recruiter is to be in the company. And that's their first real test, because you're another human being, and just how much do you believe in what you're telling me, right? And
Yeah, and a lot of it is around the credibility that we bring to the table. So I don't see it, and our teams do not see it as only pure sales, what they're trying to
right.
do, but there's a very strong conviction. And one of the things that we talk about in our value proposition is around purpose, because a lot of this technology has a huge impact on our day-to-day life,
Yeah.
on our societies, on sustainability. So for sure, there's a different story. They're not creating solutions for chatting, or no, they're
No, to
really
change society.
to
Yes.
change society. So when we talk about Siemens, we transform the everyday for everyone. That's something that we truly believe in.
Yeah. Well, you seem very excited about it. I wish you the best of luck there. I'd love to have you back when you're at your 3-year mark, maybe, and you can look back at the whole entry into Siemens. And great. Good luck there.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.